Welcome to this Angular course. It's great to have you on board. My name is Maximilian Schwarzmüller. I am a professional Angular developer and online course instructor. And with this course, I've taught hundreds of thousands of students how to use Angular and how to use it in their day-to-day jobs. And of course, my goal is to also teach you how to work with Angular, what it's all about, and to dive into all the basic and advanced features you need to know in order to become an Angular developer or to become better as an Angular developer, whatever your starting point is. Speaking of that, for this course, you need no prior Angular experience. Basic web development and JavaScript experience suffices, because we'll start at the very basics and we'll then gradually dive deeper and deeper into Angular, into the essential features, the more advanced features, so that by the end of the course, you'll be able to use Angular in your next project and you'll be able to call yourself an Angular developer. And therefore, let's not waste any time. Let's dive right in and let's start with the most important question. What exactly is Angular? Before we then, of course, also start creating Angular projects and before we then start writing code. But what is this Angular thing and why would you use it? So, what is Angular and why would you use it? Well, Angular is actually two things. First and most importantly, it's a front-end JavaScript framework, which means it's a collection of packages and rules, you could say, that you should follow when using it, that help you build advanced, feature-rich, and highly interactive web user interfaces. And Angular simply makes that process of building such user interfaces simpler and easier than it would be if you would be using just JavaScript without a framework like Angular. And I'll get back to how it does that in just a second. But Angular is actually not just this framework part, even though that's the most important part of Angular, but it's actually also a collection of tools that come together with that framework, and a collection of extra features you can use as a web developer. For example, a command line interface that helps with creating Angular projects and spinning up development servers to preview those projects, but also extra debugging tools, plugins for IDEs and code editors to enhance the development experience, and so on. And with that framework and those extra tools and features, you therefore have a platform on which you can build up to build anything from basic trivial all the way up to complex enterprise-level web applications. So now that you know what Angular is, a valid question, of course, would be why you would use Angular. Why would you use a framework like Angular in general instead of just using just JavaScript? And especially for pretty trivial web applications and web user interfaces, you indeed might not need a solution like Angular. But frameworks like Angular do really shine as your applications become more complex, because they simplify the process of building complex, highly interactive web user interfaces. And Angular does simplify this process by giving you many useful features and rules and concepts you should apply when using it, but most importantly, because of four main things it brings to the table. And the first one is that with Angular, you can write declarative code instead of imperative code as you do it with vanilla JavaScript. And this simply means that with vanilla JavaScript, you have to step by step write every single instruction that should be executed by the browser, so that you, for example, want to reach out to some DOM element, that you then have certain conditions that should be validated, and that then, depending on which condition is met or what happened, you want to change something in the DOM. You have to all write it down explicitly and give the browser those step-by-step instructions. With frameworks like Angular, that changes. There you instead write declarative code, which means you define the target state or states. So in the end, some markup that contains special instructions that are unlocked by Angular. So that would not work with just vanilla JavaScript. The browser wouldn't understand them, but they are unlocked by Angular, and they allow you to define different target states, and then you can also write some logic that makes sure that those states get activated or deactivated depending on the occurrence of certain events and so on. But it's then Angular's job to figure out which steps must be taken to update the visible user interface accordingly, so that those target states are reflected on the screen. That's what declarative code means. You don't have to manually reach out to those DOM elements or anything like that. Instead, you write declarative code in your markup, and Angular does the heavy lifting. In addition, Angular also allows you to easily separate concerns by embracing a concept called components. When working with Angular, you build a lot of so-called components, which essentially are custom HTML elements, you could say. A combination of markup, styling, and logic, which you can then use to build the overall user interface. And therefore, you can break complex user interfaces up into simpler parts and then compose them together again. But by breaking everything up into those simpler building blocks, you can also break up complex problems and reduce the complexity of the overall web user interface, and therefore simplify the development process. In addition, of course, since you do work with multiple such components, you also make it easier to work on complex applications in a team, since it's easier to assign different team members to different parts of the UI, since you have those different components anyways. Another crucial feature Angular brings to the table is that it embraces some, not all, but some object-oriented programming concepts and principles. Now, you don't have to know object-oriented programming or be an expert there. You will learn everything you need to know throughout this course, but by giving you features like dependency injection or classes, Angular gives you tools that can make it a bit easier to build complex and scalable web applications. And then there's one last tool, one last thing Angular gives you, which can also help with the development of possibly complex web user interfaces. And that would be TypeScript. Angular uses TypeScript, not vanilla JavaScript. So as an Angular developer, you actually write TypeScript code, not JavaScript code. Now, the good news is you don't need to know TypeScript for this course. You'll learn it all along the way, because in the end, TypeScript just is JavaScript with strict and strong typing added to it, so that you, for example, can't easily switch the type of a value. Or, and that's the advantage of using TypeScript, that it's easier to catch simple errors where you might be working with a value that's not necessarily set yet, or where you might be passing the wrong kind of value to a certain function or method. And without TypeScript, those errors would be undetected and would then possibly only surface at runtime when your application crashes or behaves incorrectly. With the usage of TypeScript, you can instead catch them early on during the development process, hence leading to better code quality and possibly less errors in your code. And that's why Angular does embrace TypeScript and why, as an Angular developer, you have to work with TypeScript. But as mentioned, that's not something to worry about. You'll learn it all step by step throughout this course as you're learning Angular. So now that you have an idea of what Angular is and why you might want to use it, before we start writing Angular code, there's one important thing you need to know and understand about Angular, the framework. It is a framework that keeps on evolving and innovating, though it does that in a very stable and backward compatible way, which is also important because, of course, you don't want to relearn Angular every year or so. But it's worth noting that Angular 2, the first version of Angular, was released back in 2016, and it was Angular 2 and not Angular 1 because Angular 1 is technically a totally different framework, which is now called AngularJS, which was created by the same team, or at least some team members were the same, but Angular 2 was a total rewrite, a totally different framework. But since then, there have been new versions of Angular coming out every year, or actually 2 new major versions every year, because the Angular team adopted a release policy or strategy where they try to release a new major version every 6 months. But, and that's really important, this does not mean that Angular changes every 6 months and that what you learned is obsolete after 6 months. The opposite is the case. Angular has been a super stable framework, and if you were to learn Angular 2 today, most of the code you'd write would still work with the latest Angular version, because whilst the Angular team has indeed changed some things over time and has added some new features, it always did that in a very backward compatible way, so that what you learned back then is still relevant today. Of course, with this course, I want to teach Angular to everyone who wants to work with it. But the truth is that since we have all these versions, not all teams and companies use the latest version of Angular. Indeed, the opposite is the case. Quite a big chunk of teams and companies still use older or even very old Angular versions, so they don't necessarily have access to all the new features that have been added over time. And of course, with this course, I also want to help you if you are working on a project that's using an older Angular version, which is why whenever I add content to the course or I update parts of the course, I do it such that the old content also sticks around, and I try to make it clear whether some feature can be used in older versions as well, or if it's only available if you're using a certain minimum version of Angular. So I really try my best to make sure that you get the most out of this course, no matter with which Angular version you're working. There, for example, have been 2 very important Angular releases, the versions 14 and 16, which introduced a concept called standalone components and a concept called signals. And you'll learn all about that throughout the course. I won't explain it here, of course. But it's features like this, which were added as optional features, so which were not a must use, but instead added such that you could also keep on writing code as you always did. But it's features like this which, for example, are not available if you're stuck on an older version. And I'll highlight that in the course because I want to make sure that you really learn Angular such that you can use it no matter on which project you're working, whilst of course also making sure that you're learning Angular in a modern and future-proof way. It's difficult, but it's my job. I want to make sure that you get a great course experience. And therefore, now that you know how Angular evolved and that it does that in a very backward compatible and stable way, and that there are new versions every 6 months, which don't mean that you need to relearn everything, and that with this course, I try to keep up. Now that you know all that, let's dive in and let's get started learning and using Angular.